Part of the research process will be understanding the research ethics, and this is looking at different variables such as protecting the participants and their data, looking at academic dishonesty, and particularly looking at the data management and how it is represented, and then ethical considerations with other issues such as the authorship, and then also applying to multiple journals on when to do that and so forth. So when we think of ethics, we know ethics as kind of a moral philosophy, and it's also a branch of philosophy itself. There are philosophers who kind of specialize in the field, such as medical and research ethics, and this is particularly important for us just because whenever we are performing research, we will be performing research on mostly human participants. But when we think of kind of the ethics, it's going to be kind of a overgeneralization to suggest that ethics is as simplistic as being about right versus wrong. Right? So it's not going to be kind of like that. So there are different numbers of ethical issues that you may encounter as part of the whole research process. So it's going to kind of be based off of kind of the best school of thought, and by doing so, you have to be informed about these issues, so you kind of make smart as well as ethical decision making in your decisions on whatever the case may be during this. A thing to consider with ethics is looking at academic dishonesty. So this is any misrepresentation or non-reporting of important information within the academic setting. So when you look at your syllabus, you are going to have a academic dishonesty section, and this is going to outline the different ways that academic dishonesty can be applied to or what it pertains to. With academic dishonesty, there is always going to be some sort of penalty. When we think of that penalty, it can range from just receiving a 0 for the assignment, receiving a decrease in grade for the overall class. So rather than getting an A for the class, you'll be getting a B, or you can just be expelled from the university itself. If you have friends who attend different universities, in their syllabus, they're also going to have an academic dishonesty section as well. And even for your other classes that you're taking on campus at Lindenwood and with any of your other professors, they're going to have an academic dishonesty portion too. So this is very important. So you guys kind of, provide your critical thinking skills towards the class and kind of have your own thought process and not utilizing someone else or providing any, false or misrepresenting information. Part of the issues is, it's mainly geared towards students when we think of academic dishonesty, but it can also be geared towards faculty members as well. We've talked about plagiarism before, but plagiarism is the dishonest act of presenting intellectual property, including a piece of writing, a drawing, or an idea that originated with someone else as if it had originated with you. So this is very important, particularly with your literature review and for any research papers or articles that you are writing whenever you go into graduate school. So it's not only unethical as part when we think of the ethics, but it's illegal, and this is due to the copyright law that protects most published writings within the United States. So whenever you guys are writing your literature review by reading these papers and putting that information within your review, make sure that you don't use word for word. You want to start paraphrasing and putting them into your own words, so you are not plagiarizing and not having some sort of penalty. So when we think of your penalties as students, I kind of touched on this in the academic dishonesty slide, but you can have a reduction in the grade on the paper itself. So depending on the professor, rather than getting an A that you may have gotten on the paper, it'll be dropped down to B or a C, depending on how far they want to go with it. They can give you an automatic 0 for the assignment. But depending on also how many times that you had or performed academic dishonesty within your time at the university, you can be dismissed from it too. So it's very important to paraphrase and utilize your own words, particularly when you're writing or even drawing or any of that idea in itself. But if you plagiarize in a published research paper, whenever you are writing, actually, this can kind of ruin the career within your academic area. So this can possibly lead to some sort of termination of employment and then permanent stigma with your name. So again, even whenever I write for research articles, just by looking at the original papers, I still need to paraphrase and then cite the author's work to give them credit. It is critically important that you develop a clear understanding of the difference between plagiarism and properly citing the work of others. So when we think of plagiarism and when we kind of think of the most ethical issues relating to it, it's pretty much an act of ignorance and kind of through laziness or sloppiness of your own writing. It's not really a valid excuse for actually committing plagiarism. So there are different ways that we can kind of avoid plagiarism. And two important points are, one, you can carefully keep track of which references are associated with which ideas and concepts if you are trying to take some notes or otherwise storing information to be utilized later. So this is where it's important. So whenever you're writing, even reading research papers, to highlight and then start writing it on your laptop or anything, and then automatically cite the reference. Next important point is to be careful with the selection of wording in your own writing, just such that you do not present something advocated by the authors of a published paper as your own thought. So again, these are some helpful hints on avoiding plagiarism. So by doing so, you won't have any of these ethical issues. As we discussed earlier, it is usually best to avoid direct quotations when writing, but there are specific times that you may utilize direct quotations. But again, we want to avoid that if possible. But to kind of avoid plagiarism, as we already mentioned, but this is very important, is to paraphrase. So this is restating in your own words of the author's original work. So by doing so, or by paraphrasing, we are going to require changing in both the keywords used and the sentence structure, but we aren't changing the content when we are paraphrasing of the author's work. Again, we will still need to cite the source at the very end, or you may cite the source at the very beginning, depending on how the sentence structure is utilized. If you are having some difficulty in paraphrasing or in writing in general, you can attend the library writing centers for assistance. They have people there to help with your writing by giving you kind of step by step on improving your writing by giving you some ideas of improving your outline or skeleton within that, and then also paraphrasing too. When we think of paraphrasing, though, it brings up a cautionary note for students and even for faculty members as well. So when researchers kind of paraphrase the findings of other researchers in a published paper, they can occasionally misrepresent the original findings or do not present the original findings in their entirety. So this kind of underscores the importance of reading the entire original source, not just the abstract. So do not be an abstract reader, and this is very important if you're going to actually utilize that paper and cite it. So if you kind of misrepresent or kind of just read the abstract and kind of give some sort of misrepresentation of the original paper, you'll kind of appear a little bit sloppy and foolish, depending on if you are kind of submitting it to a place, to a specific journal, or if you are at a conference and presenting some findings of your research. So always read the entire research paper. So when we think of that, and just remember that the publication of a paper does not guarantee that all statements made by the authors are correct or true. So again, this is how the media can get some facts twisted just by reading the abstract. Again, there was a paper last year or the year before where they said egg yolks were bad and very detrimental to your health. But if you read the paper, and everything. You didn't get that at all, and there were also some issues regarding the actual research study, so you couldn't really base your whole conclusion and say that egg yolks are bad for your health based off of that. But people who read the abstract, and who don't have a good understanding or grasp of how to read a research article will kind of make these claims. So just don't be sloppy. If you aren't understanding the paper properly, read it again. It may take a couple times. If it doesn't, if you're still not understanding after reading a couple times, maybe set it aside and take a couple day break in between and then read again. So, you might get a different perspective of the paper and kind of a different viewpoint, and you may be able to understand it a lot better. With paraphrasing, this will help improve your writing style as compared to just directly quoting original research paper. But you may wonder under what circumstances it is not necessary to cite a published paper for something you want to write about. So we talked about, citing the author's work, but there are some cases that you don't have to cite. So the general rule is that anything regarded as common knowledge does not need to be cited. So let's just take, for example, nowadays we know that cigarette smoking is unhealthy and is kind of considered common knowledge. But back in the day, that wasn't always the case. But after hundreds of published research studies showing how cigarette smoking can lead to different cancers and different health consequences, we can now, after the so many years, say that this is common knowledge. So if you're still unsure whether you can properly label something as common knowledge while you are reading some of your research literature, or not reading your research literature, but looking at the papers and then writing it for your review paper, it's always safest to cite it, just so if anything would possibly arise, you have it cited and still giving the author some sort of work or giving someone credit, not utilizing it as your own. At many universities, there's an expectation that faculty members will engage in an active program of research or scholarship that results in publication of papers contributing to the knowledge base in peer-reviewed journals and thus contributing to the field within their area. Unfortunately, though, there are some professors out there that have, some sort of temptation to falsify or fabricate data to enhance their publication records. Other ways that, these professors or other researchers can fabricate their data is, just by manipulating or, taking out certain individuals. So by doing so, that can enhance their results. You may see this for individuals who are being paid for their research study, such as receiving some funding. So, for example, a supplement company can provide the researchers the product and give them money, but the one stipulation that the company wants is that they want something positive come out of it. So, as a researcher, some of them will perform the research study, and then even if they find out the product doesn't work, they'll maybe remove some individuals or some individuals' data, or kind of manipulate the data so that the supplement that they studied will have a positive outcome. So whenever the marketing company of that research company or the supplement company says this is backed by science and so forth, and there's a 20% increase in bench in 2 weeks, and within the first 2 weeks, this can be possibly why. Another related ethical question regarding data management has to do with the appropriate handling of outliers. So you're always going to have some sort of outlier within your data set. So an outlier is a measurement or observation that is way out of line with the rest of the data set. This is somewhat normal. For research studies, there's always going to be, particularly for human research studies, that you're always going to have one extreme responder per se, where they're going to respond very well to the protocol that you're producing. So they may drive up some of the the values and mean values for you. But it's always a good idea to look at these outliers just so you can kind of figure out what to kind of interpret the results on. So even though we have an outlier from a participant who responds very well from a protocol that differs from different participants, you can also have an outlier resulting from an error in data collection. So just for example, if you are looking at the ratings of perceived exertion following exercise, such as say a 1 mile biking for at an intensity of 70% of the individual's heart rate max, at the end they may say that their rating was a 13 for their perceived exertion, but as the data collector you may have misheard it and wrote 17, so that can kind of skew the results after you input it into the data set or the software program itself. So it's very important that whenever you are dealing with any type of numbering or any data collection, to always double check your data while you're collecting. So this is so it can be avoided. Again, we can have some other cases as well, such as a bug in the software that you are utilizing for whatever measurement device. There are different measurement devices that can measure force. It can measure other things as well. And these devices are usually run by some sort of software. So that could be another issue where normally when the device is working properly, it's going to give you these certain range values, and this is all just based off of past literature of, if you have an individual perform a bicep curl at 70% of their 1 rep max, they should see some sort of muscle activation level onto the software program within a certain range. But there might be, with that bug, cause a lot smaller value or a huge value. So whenever that occurs, always note any malfunctions on the equipment and kind of note that. If you have individuals who are sick, sometimes they may come in, they may perform one set, and then they may want to go home or quit for the day. So that's fine for you. It's going to be appropriate that you can discard that faulty data for that day and just kind of reschedule them for another time, so you can get some good results rather than them kind of slacking in a sense for that. An example for inappropriate data management though would be scanning the data set for values that don't support your research hypothesis, and then labeling those values as some sort of outliers and discarding them. So whatever the case may be, you should not discard any data unless you have some sort of error possibly whenever you're collecting data, and may have misheard that. So it's very useful to keep in mind that sometimes it is the results that you didn't really expect that turn out to be the most interesting and most publishable for your research study whenever you are submitting to journals. So just kind of your take-home message: always double check your data collection values and make sure to always take note if anything has any sort of malfunction. Part of the research process is that there are federal regulations governing the storage and management of data collection on human participants, particularly when the data are health related. So the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA, signed into the law in 1996. So this regulates the ways in which the protected health information, or PHI, can be stored and utilized. So, PHI is any information that's related to the past, present, or future health of an individual. So many research studies that are conducted within, exercise science rely on this information for some screening purposes or as a primary data source. So with, researchers, they may access the PHI legally following a participant sign off on by having a participant sign off on an authorization form that includes the required HIPAA authorization language and so forth. Another way is that researchers can use the PHI that has been de-identified in blinded studies, so that the researcher is not aware of which information is associated with a particular participant when they are collecting the data. So the use of personal non-public information, such as your social security number, is also federally regulated. The information that you have or that you contain should not be used for participant identification. But beyond that, beyond HIPAA and the personal non-public information issues, most institutions require that the original data set be stored in a secured location for a minimum of at least 3 years following the completion of the actual research study. With that being said, usually whenever you go to these research places or perform a research study, you usually have a filing cabinet. That filing cabinet is locked, and it's stored within the room that's also locked. If you have stuff that's put on a computer, again, that's usually password protected. So to log on into the computer to access whatever the software is, you have to know the password. So that's a way to kind of give some sort of security for individuals. As we discussed previously in lectures, in the United States, every college or university, hospital, clinical setting, and research institute at which investigators engage in research on human participants must have an institutional review board, or IRB, which is responsible for reviewing all research proposals involving human participants. So the Code of Federal Regulations, which is administered by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, mandates the role of the IRB. So by doing so, this requires training for the protection of human participants in research for all of the researchers, so faculty, students, staff, anyone involved that is working with human subjects, or interacting with them, will have to take some sort of training. Again, individuals who will have access to identifiable private information also have to go through training. So by doing so, this is knowing your kind of background or the ethics of research. So, but before you're even allowed to be involved in research of human subjects, you have to complete a training session, and then most universities are going to offer these online, and as well as live formats. So for here at Lindenwood University, you go through city training. That's the most popular type of training. Within city training, there are different subcategories depending on what type of research you're going into and possibly what devices and measurements that you're utilizing. So you can go, mainly you're going to go to a certain section for human subjects, but there's a subject for utilizing animals. There's certain sections utilizing based off of the equipment, such as blood draws and so forth, and what to do with that. So basically with city training and this type of training for the IRB is it gives you the history, why they have certain laws and kind of criteria, and kind of some guidelines of what to follow, of what to do with individuals' information, so you can protect these participants by not leaking out their information, and by doing so, and by passing, you're demonstrating that you know what to do in certain situations involving human subjects during the research process. So for your research proposal to be accepted, there's certain criteria which were established in the United States that the IRB has to follow for the approval. So one of them is that the risk to participants are minimized by utilizing procedures which are consistent with sound research design and which do not unnecessarily expose participants to risk. Another one is that risks to participants are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits, if any, to participants, and the importance of the knowledge that may reasonably be expected to result. So this is basically meaning that that kind of the risk benefit ratio, is kind of outweighed by the benefits. So let's just say, for an example, that we want to have individuals exercise, performing some sort of cycling for certain miles. Part of the risks is that they might feel lightheadedness following exercise. They may feel fatigued. They may have delayed onset muscle soreness for a few days after, depending on their training status, and so forth. So those are some of your risks, but the benefits though are going to kind of outweigh that. So with the benefits, they're going to get some information about themselves. They're going to have health benefits on improving their cardiovascular system, improving their skeletal muscle, respiratory system, etc., just by participating in the research study. Because usually if you're participating in a research study, it's usually going to be a few visits at least, so you're going to get some benefit out of that. Another criteria is the selection of participants is equitable. Another one is going to be that the informed consent will be sought from each prospective participant or the participant's legally authorization or authorized representative. Some other criteria is that the informed consent will be appropriately documented. Another one is the research plan makes adequate provision for monitoring the data collected to ensure the safety of the participants. So this can be possibly due to some blood draws. So we want to make sure that, sometimes people don't deal with needles very well. So we want to ensure that the, data that you got, or the blood, that the participant is also safe. All right, so they can pass out, but by preventing them passing out, you can have them sit down, sit in a chair, kind of recline, let the blood flow go through. All right, so you won't have them pass out on the floor and then possibly hit their head on some sort of ledge or table. Lastly, part of the IRB approval for your research proposal is that there are adequate provisions to protect the privacy of participants and to maintain the confidentiality of the data. This kind of ties back into the HIPAA laws and then also your city training, where after you obtain some of their data, kind of their characteristics on how that is being stored. Again, when you're talking about some of their information throughout the study protocol and then so forth, that in the paperwork, that's usually in a filing cabinet that's locked in a separate room, which is also locked. And if it's any computer-based information that you're inputting, that computer is locked with a password. When we look at the criteria list for the research proposal for the IRB, items 1 and 2 are often referred to as the risks and benefits to the participants in the study. So there are two separate, they're related concepts here. The first is that the researchers should plan in every way practically possible to minimize any risks to participants participating in the study. So what this means is that we are ensuring that the data collected and the conditions are as safe as possible and that the likelihood of injury to participants is very minimal. So this is going to require some knowledge on the part of the investigators or the researchers, such as you, about any special concerns or needs associated with special populations, such as the children, any of the elderly that you may be often involved in or incorporating into the study, or those with medically diagnosed conditions. So in the case of any training interventions, it's also required some knowledge of sound exercise durations and loading increments. So if you are participating in a resistance training protocol, we have to know what the proper appropriate load to increase that weight is, and based off of how many repetitions or based off of certain time measurement points. So you don't want to plan a training protocol that will result in any injuries, or you may have some of your participants drop out. So if you have participants perform multiple 1RM attempts, that's very consistent or very frequently, that could possibly lead to injury, and then by doing so they'll be dropping out. So you want to try to find that good balance of, pushing the individuals to help answer your research question, but also finding that balance that they are not going to injure themselves. So that's where, whenever you are, instructing the participants during the protocol and then the certain exercises, you want to actually perform the exercise technique to them, and then also have them follow that exercise technique by utilizing a very light load so they can get some sort of familiarization of what they're going to do. The second concept is known as the risk to benefit ratio. So when we look at this is any known or potential risk incurred by the participants by virtue of participation in a study should not outweigh any benefits for the participants. So a single serious risk is not likely to be kind of outweighed by any number of perceived benefits. So just to kind of give you some example of some benefits for the participants, it may include some gift cards worth $25 depending on how many sessions they complete. It can also do, by doing so, increase in value for that. So most of the studies, when you look at some gift cards, they'll have, if you complete half the study, you're going to get half of the gift card or money's worth. Well, if you complete the full study, you'll get the full amount of money by participating in that. So not only are you having the participants gain some benefit through like some sort of exercise or intervention or some sort of test that will help benefit them in some sort of way, you're also giving them some sort of monetary compensation gift by participating in that. If you are looking to do some research participation just in general, that's going to be based off of your own voluntary experience, but other professors might give out say extra credit as part of this. So particularly graduate students performing their master's thesis here at Lindenwood are looking for participants. So to help get some sample size and recruitment, professors will offer extra credit. So by completing the study, you'll get say 10 points of extra credit. So that could be a benefit for you guys. Also, there might be some sort of requirements depending on your class. So again, for this class, there's a research requirement that's for you guys to complete, and this can take on many forms. One of them is by participating in a research study. So all you have to do is complete the research study, sign the form that's printed on Canvas or that's put on campus for you guys, and submit it, and then you will meet that assignment requirement. But the thing whenever you're looking kind of having students participate based off of extra credit is that usually and just by recruitment in general of anyone, they can't be coerced into the study, so they can't be highly persuaded or kind of forced to do it, meaning for that, just because that is again unethical. So another thing when we think about this risk to benefit ratio is that known or potential risks to participate are taken very seriously, and if any risk cannot be well managed, a proposed study is not likely going to be approved by the IRB. So that's why these individuals or the committee for the IRB have monthly meetings that they go over these research proposals just to make sure that there aren't any very serious injuries that cannot be managed, and so whenever they do approve it, that they won't come into any of these situations. The third item of the criteria list for the research approval within the IRB is designed to ensure that the participant population has been selected because it is the most appropriate population for participation given the research problem that is being conducted. So there have been unfortunate cases where past researchers used prisoners for medical experiments, not just because they were appropriate for the study, but because they had no ability to object to the treatments. So these prisoners, they were just mainly forced to do this medical experiment, right, without them having the right to say no, that they don't want to participate. So remember, when we were talking about the research study itself, and recruiting participants. The participant always has the right to voluntarily participate in the study, or choose not to. So it's always up to them. You get some participants who are interested after they, once they hear that, interest of what type of study you're doing, they can come and you can kind of explain a little bit more detail on what's going on, explain to them, the risk benefits and everything, and the time commitment and so forth. So usually when you're trying to pitch your research study, you're just kind of giving and mainly hitting the highlights of the study. But once they come in for the paperwork or want more information, that's where you start getting into the more detailed aspect itself. But due to the unethical behavior on part of the past researchers, that is kind of the reason today we have federal and international standards for protection of human participants in research, and that's why we have to go through the city training, so we kind of know what are the ethical reasons, or what's ethical utilizing human subjects within our research. Items 4 and 5 are part of the criteria list that are the concept of the informed consent. So the informed consent is an agreement to participate in a research study following full understanding of the requirements, risks, and benefits of participation. So this is where the individual provides his or her consent to actually participate. So the U.S. Code of Federal Regulation identifies the elements of the informed consent, which we will go over here in the next few slides. So here are some of the elements of the informed consent, and by doing so, this is going to be providing the participant with certain information. One of them is that a statement that contains that the study involves some sort of research, an explanation of the purposes of the research and the expected duration of the participant's participation, a description of the procedures to be followed, and identification of any procedures which are experimental. So during this time, whenever you're explaining the purpose, so say you are looking at a resistance training study, so your purpose would be looking at the effects of performing 3 sets of 10 compared to 3 sets of 12 on muscle strength and muscle size. You can also break this down in the informed consent of the expected duration. So here you're just giving the outline of how many times per week that they are lifting. So you can say 2 times per week for 20 minutes for each session, for a total of 12 weeks. All right? You're also going to be including pre and post-testing measurements as well. So you're going to have to factor in that time frame. So those days may be a little bit longer compared to the actual training days in itself. So this will give you some sort of leeway and kind of give some sort of expectation for the participants. A description of the procedure, so what you'll be doing, so what each test involves, such as what you're measuring. So if you're performing a 1RM to see which sets are better and repetition schemes better, the 1RM, you have to break it down and tell them what you're doing and what it's gonna kind of mean and entail for them. And also any procedures which are experimental. So some, it all depends on what area you're going into, but this can be still part of the description of the procedures that it's going to be followed or that the participant will be following. Another portion or another element of the informed consent is a description of any reasonably foreseeable risk or discomforts to the participants. So this is kind of where you write out what the kind of risks are participating in the research study. Mainly if you're dealing with exercise, you're dealing with increased heart rate, increased breathing, DOMS following exercise for a few days, possibly headiness while they're exercising. So those are just kind of examples. If you're doing anything else like strapping on some sort of belt or anything, or whatever the case may be for your research problem, you have to let them know. Another element is a description of any benefits to the participant or to others which may reasonably be expected from the research. So this kind of ties in on what we talked about on the risk to benefit ratio items. Continuing on the elements of informed consent, another one is that a statement describing the procedures by which confidentiality of records identifying the participant will be maintained. So again, this is all going back to the HIPAA laws and what we talked about earlier in this lecture, where if you are going to write down any of their information or signature, that's all going to be stored safely and with locks and passwords and everything. Another component is for research involving more than minimal risk, an explanation as to whether any compensation and explanation as to whether any medical treatments are available if injury occurs, and if so, what they consist of or where further information may be obtained. So when we think of any research involving more than minimal risk, whether any compensation and explanation, probably a good example would be taking a muscle biopsy. Some research studies looking at, say, some biomarkers for looking at certain variables following ingestion of a meal. We'll want to take a muscle biopsy just to see how the muscle is responding to that type of meal. So what they do is they have to take some piece of muscle out of you, and you have to give them some sort of compensation just because they are. Usually they're always going to have to pay you when taking a muscle biopsy, but they have some risks of like you're losing a chunk of muscle, possibly bleeding, so forth, for the injury to occur. Resistance training, there's not too minimal risk is just going to be your basic risks of lifting, but if you're doing something a little bit more extreme on the end of resistance training, where an injury may occur more likely, then you'd have to let them know too. Another element is an explanation of whom to contact for answers to pertinent questions about the research and research participants' rights, and whom to contact in the event of a research-related injury to the participant. So this is a portion whenever you are in the informed consent. You usually provide the individual or have them, or actually you give them a kind of a copy of the informed consent. You can always ask them. Most likely they won't care. Just because they don't want to have the paperwork, but some individuals do like to have that paperwork, and it's also probably good practice to give them the informed consent so they can read over it too. But during this time, this is where you're going to put your email, phone number, so if they have any questions, they can contact you immediately. There's also going to be a portion within the informed consent about the participants' rights, saying that there's no penalty if they quit the research study, that they have the the right to quit at any time and so forth. But usually a good thing with this portion or this section is that it's a good time if you are having human subjects and that require multiple visits over courses of weeks to exchange contact information, just because they might need to reschedule a session, or they may be running late. So depending if you have the time or on time constraints, that's a good information to have. Also, if something happens to your equipment, like a malfunction that you can't have them come in and complete a testing protocol or anything of that, that's a good way to notify them that, like, hey, you don't have to come in, there's malfunction, let's reschedule for tomorrow. So you can still get the data from them. So a lot of different things with the informed consent that can you utilize in what you're explaining to. Another element of the informed consent is containing a statement that the participation is voluntary and refusal to participate will involve no penalty or loss of benefits to which the participant is otherwise entitled, and the participant may discontinue participation at any time without penalty or loss of benefits to which the participant is otherwise entitled. So I mentioned this earlier, but they have the right to stop coming in and performing any research help for you at any time without any penalty, and this is all due to that federal and international standards of where that one situation occurred where they utilize prisoners without having some sort of consent and just having them conduct the study. Another one is the anticipated circumstances under which the participant's participation may be terminated by the investigator without regard to the participant's consent should also be included. And lastly, the approximate number of participants involved in the study. So usually this is just going to give some sort of range when you're looking at the number of participants involved in the study. And this is where you are kind of utilizing some sort of statistical power on trying to find what is the number that you want to reach to find and help answer your research problem. But you're not going to put the exact number in. Generally speaking, whenever you are putting this into the informed consent, you're usually giving the max amount of numbers, or a number usually about 10 over is always kind of a safe number, just because with human participation, there's going to be times that individuals won't completely finish their protocol or finish the study, and some people may drop out, so that can have an effect on your statistical analysis that you run later. If you have too less, it may not be as meaningful. So you're always just kind of factoring in individuals dropping out. So all of these elements of the informed consent must appear in the form to be signed by participants prior to the study. One thing though is that the wording of each element that we went over is very specific to what the participants will actually be doing in the study. So whenever you are writing the informed consent, the language must be lay, and meaning that it's very understandable by the participants. And generally, whenever you are writing, you want to write at an 8th grade level for these individuals, or for the informed consent. But the informed consent at the end, after you go through it, the procedures, the purposes, the risk, the benefit ratio, and so forth, the right to withdraw, you will have them sign at the end. You'll also be signing as well. So even though you guys are both signing a document, it is not a legal document. And the formatting, whenever you look at informed consents, are all going to differ depending on what university you're helping do a research study at. But one thing though, whenever you're going through this informed consent with participants, is that you should write notes while informing the participant, and if they have any questions. So if they do have a question, you can usually kind of write it next to wherever you were trying to explain, possibly some sort of procedure or testing measurement, and then by writing that question out and then saying what type of answer you gave them, that will help them gain a little bit more, or be a little bit more comfortable, or gain a little bit more knowledge of knowing what they're going into. So that's always a good thing. Sometimes you'll have individuals, if that happens, if they're not understanding and you explain, after you write down what they asked and what you told them, have them read that over and then have them initial that, so they kind of understand that you went over that question and answered their question appropriately. Again, like I mentioned, you can make a copy of the informed consent for the individual. You are always going to keep the original paperwork, but they can have a copy of it so they can look at it a little bit later. Whenever you're conducting a study with children under the age of 18 years, an informed consent form must be developed for signature by each participant's parent or legal guardian. Additionally, a separate form called the assent form must be developed for signature by each child participant. So this assent form is a document explaining the requirements, the risks, and the benefits of participation in a research study in language appropriate for child participants. Depending on the age range of the child participants, the language that you write about may be needed further simplified so that they can read it. Whenever you are conducting research on children who have limited ability or no ability to read, you must be able to read the assent form to them. You might also come into scenarios where some young children may not be able to sign the form either. So, having a checkbox for them can be a substitute for the signature. Just as we have policies that exist for protection of human participants, we also have policies that help protect animals in research studies as well. So the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, published by the National Academy of Sciences, also kind of gives some sort of outline or criteria list for approval of the research proposal. One of them is that the design and performance of procedures on the basis of relevance to human or animal health, also that it provides advancement of knowledge or the good of society. Another is the use of appropriate species, quality, and number of animals are involved. Avoidance or minimization of discomfort, distress, and pain in concert with sound science. And the use of appropriate sedation, analgesia, or anesthesia is utilized. Another criteria is the establishment of experimental endpoints. Also, the provision of appropriate animal husbandry directed and performed by qualified persons should also be considered. And lastly, conduct of experimentation on living animals only by or under the close supervision of qualified and experienced persons should also be in the kind of the proposal. So many universities have an animal subjects protection committee, which they are assigned to and provide the responsibility of reviewing all these research proposals that involve animal subjects. Another ethical consideration is looking at authorship. So you probably don't have much thought about the authorship of published research papers. I'm sure you don't care about the order of the authors listed and who gets named as an author for the paper in the first place. But it's kind of good practice, or kind of have a good understanding on who is going to be listed as an author and then who isn't listed as an author. So usually authors normally include only those who were directly involved in planning the study, helping interpret the results, and writing the actual paper. What you'll see is a list of different authors. First author, this is the individual who had the underlying idea for the study and who was most instrumental in getting the study conducted, and then also writes the paper in its entirety of the research study. While your co-authors, they're still involved on helping you get the study going and the idea and helping you collect some data. But this too is just a little bit to a lesser degree. And they're still helping you write the paper per se by proofreading it for you after you write it, giving you feedback and sending you feedback on making the necessary adjustments of wording, or they may have some sort of paper that they just read to incorporate that might help make your results a little bit stronger or your explanation a little bit stronger. But depending on your co-authors and how the list goes will be basically how much they contributed to. So the second author is usually an individual who contributes a lot more compared to the fourth or fifth author on the list. You will see in the research articles towards the end of the paper, you'll see acknowledgments. So these are individuals such as technicians that help assist with data collection, or statistical consultants, or individuals just helping out for like a day or two. So they don't get any authorship when you write the paper or the paper is being published, but they are acknowledged. They're not going to have their full names like you would see on the authorship. Most likely you're going to see their names as kind of their initials, their first and last initials. But whenever we are looking at kind of this authorship, and whenever you are planning to submit, this is a good idea to have. Usually the last person is going to be the principal investigator. So your principal investigator is the one who has the contact information. So when the paper is published, and if individuals want to receive the full text of it, if they can't access it, they can email them, or if they just have any questions relating to the paper, or any questions relating to actually coming to the university and performing their thesis or dissertation for that. But one of the things is that whenever we are submitting these manuscripts, you should only be submitting it to one journal at a time. So when you think of these, is that it's kind of bad if you are submitting multiple submissions to journals at the same time, just because you might get into a scenario where both journals accept your work. So that doesn't really look good on you, saying, oh, I submitted to this journal, so I'm gonna have to pull out. Usually whenever you are submitting, you have an idea of what journal you want to submit to, but at times, if you're not sure, you would always want to go for the highest journal impact factor, just because that's a good indicator of quality research paper for you to read. But with these different manuscripts, it's always good to still aim high, just because if anything, a good thing may come out of it is that they give you revisions, and these revisions are going to help make your paper a lot stronger. So whenever you apply to another journal, maybe to a lesser degree, it's going to be submitted relatively quickly. Some things that need to be completed by Monday, October 12th by 11:59 p.m. is quiz number 5, and also the article review assignment by Bridges and colleagues. Make sure that, again, that is a Word document or PDF file and no pictures or screenshots of your answers. Also, please submit your city training assignment, which is found in the announcement section and in the assignment section, and you can follow the link. Make sure that you are following the biomedical research investigators, and that's the certification that you want to go for. Once you pass that test, please download that certification and then submit that certification into Canvas.